Last week, Jonathan spoke on Esther. I had no idea that he was going to speak on Esther as being the last message before we ended lockdown. He had no idea that I was going to be speaking on Esther as the first message when we come out of lockdown. So obviously God has something to say to us from this particular story of Esther. Jonathan did give quite a background, so I'm not going to go into all those details. But before we read some verses, let me give you a brief background to the story of Esther. We all know the story of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and how that they, with many others, in fact, the whole nation of Israel, the southern kingdom of Israel at that time, had been taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar into Babylon. And that was whenever the people arrived in captivity, where the psalmist tells us that they sat down by the rivers of Babylon and they refused to sing and they refused to play their instruments. That's not just a song that was sung by Boney M. That's an actual historical fact. That's what happened. And it was during those years that Babylon, even though it was such an incredible empire, that at that time literally ruled the world as Rome did later on. Yet Babylon had been invaded and was defeated by the Medes and by the Persians. Again, another historical fact. And when the Medes and Persians took control of Babylon, that put the Jewish people who were still captive but had grown and had taken positions of power and authority across Babylon. And so some of the Medes and Persians didn't like this. And one particular person called Haman actually began to work against the Jewish people and worked to have them exterminated, completely and totally exterminated. But there was one person at that time that God had in place. One person who was close to the king of Persia. And that person was Esther. I want to tell you, friends, God always has his person, his man or woman or young person in place. And there's sometimes that he looks and he sees the gap and he looks for someone to stand in the gap. And God will always find someone to stand in the gap. And when the Jewish people were facing extinction, God had Esther in a right place. Her cousin Mordecai, who was quite well known and popular, had been in Babylon and now Persia at that particular time. Mordecai understood the dangers of the time. And Mordecai began to reach out to Esther, his cousin, to see what she could do in order to prevent the extinction or the extermination of her people. He reached out and is asking her, please approach the king and see what you can do on behalf of our people. This is her response. We'll see some verses. In Esther 4 and verse 11, she responds to Mordecai and she says, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law. And that one law is this, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. And it's like Esther saying, there's only one law for anyone that dares to approach the king unless he has summoned them to do so. And that one law is that those who are around the king to protect him, no matter who that person is, if they've not been summoned, they are to immediately put that person to death. And the only thing that's going to save their lives is that the king acts quick enough and raises his golden scepter to save them. And Esther's pointing this out, but then she says, but 30 days have passed since I was called to the king. I've not been near the king in 30 days. How can I go and simply approach him? Verse 12. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, that you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. It's like he's sending some kind of veiled threat to Esther. But then he goes on, and this is the most famous part and the most positive part of his response. And he says, and who knows, but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Who knows, Esther, but you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. None of us in this place are in the kind of royal position that Esther had found herself in. In fact, very few people ever get anywhere near royalty. You see the Queen on television giving her speech and so on for Christmas, more recently for other reasons, talking about things. And yet what Mordecai said to Esther, I believe applies to all of us, no matter where we are, no matter about our circumstances, no matter our backgrounds, where we come from. This applies to all of us. And so I want to say to all of you in this place this morning, and I want to say it with a greater sense of certainty than Mordecai said to Esther. Because who knows, he's saying. He's kind of hoping he's right. Who knows? But I want to say with a greater sense of certainty to everyone in this place this morning, you have come to this place for such a time as this. Some of you have wondered what's been going on over the past 4 months, the past year. Today's the anniversary of the first lockdown. I mean, we weren't in church this time last year, but now we're in church this time this year. We're coming out of it 1 year on. And we look back and we wonder what's been going on. In the past 4 months, we thought it was going to be a few weeks, then another few weeks, then another few weeks. But I want to say today with certainty, you are here regardless of the circumstances. And you got to grasp this today, friends. This is not just about New Life City Church having another service. This is about you knowing that you are where God has placed you, that you are here for such a time as this. This is your time. This is our time. This is our time not only as a local church, this is our time as the Church of Jesus Christ. Some people are sitting about waiting for a new revelation. We don't need another revelation. God has given us revelation after revelation after revelation concerning the purpose of the church. So we're not sitting around waiting for another revelation. The fact is, there never was a time when it was not our time as the church. From the day and hour the church was birthed, this has been our time. This is our time to preach the gospel. More than anything else. Hey, I can yell and scream and cheer about Liverpool more than anyone and get down in the dumps whenever I see them going through their bad times. But my purpose on this earth is not to cheer on Liverpool. My purpose is to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, and that's the purpose of the church. We're here to preach the gospel. This is our time. This is our time to make disciples. There never was a time when we were not to make disciples. This is our time to be disciples, to be true followers of Jesus Christ. This is our time to be worshipers, not just to be singers of songs and to follow those who lead us and play instruments. This is our time to be true worshipers, to be the worshipers the Father seeks. And that's those who don't just sing the songs, but live it out in their daily lives. We sang this morning, I'm going to sing in the middle of the storm. Do you know what that's like? Do you really know what that's like? We can sing it in church. Hey, I'm going to sing in the middle of the storm. What happens when you're in that storm? What a lot of people do is like the children of Israel when they were taken captive into Babylon. They put down their harps, they hang them on the willow tree, and they refuse to play and they refuse to sing. Come on. Jesus said the Father seeks those who will worship him in spirit and in truth. And that's not about a confined place. That's about our lives and our lifestyle to worship him regardless of the circumstances that we're going through, to sing even in the middle of the storm. Friends, it's our time. It's always been our time. But we've got to grasp the moment. And that's the problem. We may well acknowledge it's our time, but we just let the moment pass. I'm encouraging you today. I'm appealing to you. Do not let this moment pass. Do not let this pass as just another Sunday morning. We were at church, we waved at a few people and so on. Do not let this moment pass. We just had a church service. Grasp the moment today. This is our time. Let me remind you of a few people in the Word of God just very quickly. Abraham was living in Ur of the Chaldees, modern day Iraq. That's where, if he was alive today, he would be 3,500 years old or whatever the case is. But he would be an Iraqi, and a modern day Iraqi. He lived in Ur of the Chaldees, and he lost a brother. He knew what it was to lose someone close to him. We heard about Wilbur losing his brother. I've lost 2 brothers. It's tough. Abraham lost his brother. His father Terah decided that they weren't going to stay in Haran where they lived, or that they were going to move on. They left Ur of the Chaldees. They moved on and they came to a place called Haran. His son was called Haran, but it's spelled slightly different, but they came to another place called Haran. They were on their way to Canaan. That's where Terah wanted to take his grieving family. They never made it to Canaan. They settled in Haran, and when they were there, Terah died. Abraham was now in a situation where he lost his brother. Now he lost his father. And it was at that moment that God called him. I want to tell you, friends, sometimes it's in the middle of your darkest season. Sometimes it's in the midst of your grief that God comes along and that God called you, because God has not finished with you. Just because of the darkness, just because of the grief, just because of the loss does not mean that God is finished with you. God called Abraham right there in the midst of his grief. And it's like God was saying to Abraham, Abraham, you're here for such a time as this. I want you to follow me to a place that I'm going to show you. Didn't give him all the details. Called him to follow him. Abraham set out and followed God. Then there was Joseph. Remember, Joseph had been messed about by his brothers and others. Ended up being tossed down a pit, beaten, left for dead. Ended up being falsely accused afterwards and tossed into prison. He had his dreams about what was going to happen, how the God was going to use him. And now he finds himself in the darkness of a prison cell. His dreams are just a memory. Those that he had shared with are gone. He's now isolated. He's on his own. And there comes a day whenever someone that was an old cellmate remembered him. And he speaks of Joseph to Pharaoh. And the result was that Joseph was brought out of the prison cell. And it's like God is saying, Joseph, even though it's all gone against you, you need to know that the pit and the false accusations in the prison, that was not to destroy you, that was to bring you to this place. Because Joseph, you're here for such a time as this. And this is now your time. Then there was Moses. John had mentioned Moses today, how that Moses stood in the backside of the wilderness. He'd been there for 40 years. 40 years in the backside of the desert. There's one thing worse than being in the one thing worse than being in the wilderness. It's being in the backside of the wilderness, and that's where Moses was. Couldn't have been any further down. 40 years he had run away from the palace of Pharaoh, where he was second to Pharaoh in Egypt. Now he's looking after sheep belonging to his father-in-law in a strange place. And it's then that he finds himself standing before this bush that's burning, and God spoke to him, and it's like God is saying, Moses, all that was to get you to this place for this moment, because this is now your time. This is your time to go back to Egypt, and this is your time to lead those people into real freedom. Remember whenever Jesus saw Peter and James and John at their fishing nets, he called them to follow him. They were doing the normal stuff, the routine stuff. And Jesus is saying, guys, it's now your time to do something else. It's time to leave your nets to the side and come and follow me. He saw Matthew working in the tax office, doing his mundane job, and he speaks out and he says, Matthew, it's now your time. You're there for such a time as this. It's time to step out of the office. It's time to stop taking and start giving. It's time to follow me, Matthew. When Tarsus was on his way to Damascus to persecute the Christians, Jesus stopped him in his tracks. And it's like Jesus is saying to Saul, look, it's time you stop persecuting the church, and it's time you stop persecuting me. This is your time, Saul. It's your time to follow me. It's your time to come off your high horse and follow me. And person after person after person, right throughout the Word of God, they come to those moments in their lives when God is speaking to them. And God is saying, no, all this was to bring you to where you are. You need to know that you're here now for this moment in time. And you're here for such a time as this. Friends, I want to say to you this morning, you may not be living between the rivers like Abraham was. You may not be in prison like Joseph was, although some of you know what that's been like. You may not be in the backside of the wilderness, wondering what life was all about and looking back on the glory days of life and things are not as good as what they were. You may not be mending your fishing nets like Peter, James, and John, or working in the tax office like Matthew, or riding about in your high horse like Saul of Tarsus. You may not be in those particular situations, but I want to tell you, as you've gathered in this place this morning, this is your time. This message is for you. It's not for the person beside you. It's for you personally. You got to grasp hold of this. And collectively, it's for us as a church. This is what Mordecai was saying to Esther. Mordecai could see that Esther was well placed to save the Jewish people. Well placed to save a nation from extinction, from being destroyed. And so he said to her, who knows that you're here for such a time as this? God has brought you to this royal position. God has allowed you to be in that situation. God has permitted that to happen. But he's done it for such a time as this. It's your moment, Esther. Her response was to point out the negatives, but then he responds back and she gives him a more positive response. And her response was, I believe, so amazing because she asked Mordecai and the Jewish people to do two things: to fast and to pray for 3 days. To fast and to pray for 3 days. And as she said, at the end of those days, I will go to the king. You pray about it, you fast about it. And then she says to Mordecai, once you do that, I want you to know I will go to the king. And then she says this, even if I am breaking the law, I will go to the king. Well, she knew the law said you were not to enter the king's palace, the room that he was in, the throne room. You were not to approach the king unless you were something. She knew that was the law of the Medes and Persians. There's been a phrase about for thousands of years, and it's quite simply this: it's not the law of the Medes and Persians. I don't know if you've ever heard that. I've used that several times. And that literally means when you say it's the law of the Medes and Persians, it can't be changed. So when you say something like it's not the law of the Medes and Persians, you're saying, well, it can be changed. This was the law of the Medes and Persians. It could not be changed, and Esther knew that. And so she said to Mordecai, you and the Jewish people, put it out there, get the nation to pray and fast for 3 days. Then I will go to the king, even if it is against the law. And then she says this, and if I die, I die. I was birthed in that attitude as a believer in Jesus Christ. I've lived my life as a believer in Christ with this, not just as a pastor, but as a young guy on the Shankill Road. Not about breaking the laws. Not about breaking the laws. But that when God challenges us to do it, and you face the giant in the middle of the battlefield, you're prepared to step out, whether you live or whether you die. This was Esther's attitude now. I will go into the king. And if I die, I die. But the end result was not that Esther died. The end result was that Esther found favor with the king. Because that was what God had planned. It was never God's desire and purpose that his people would be destroyed, but that they would rise above the circumstances. They would rise above the threats and the intimidation and the possibility of extinction. And so she found favor with the king, and so that the annihilation of the Jewish people was averted, and they lived for another day, and still around today. I want to tell you, friends, that when God calls us to follow him or to do something, and we respond in obedience to that, God will not only bless us, and he will bless us because of that, but I believe that through our obedience that others will be blessed and others will also live because of our obedience. There are people who are alive today because some of us dared to walk in obedience. I got a message from one guy during the week. Hadn't meant to say this, I'm not going to. But one guy messaged me during the week, and I'm delighted he's in church this morning, to remind me how that I visited him when he was 16. In Young Offender Centre. Led him to faith in Christ. 2 weeks later, he broke out of the Offender Centre. He backslid after 2 weeks, broke out of the Offender Centre. Next time I saw him, his legs were in plaster because UVF had blown the muscles off the back of his legs. And he messaged me to say how that he knows that his life's been saved. And I think he said, I can't remember, something like 14 attempts in his life. And because of our obedience, I want to tell you, friends, not only will we be blessed, but others will bless and others will live. We're prepared to step up and take a chance. I believe there are people that are alive today because some of you here, you've taken a chance on people. And we say take a chance because sometimes that's what we do. We take a chance on people. We take a chance because we're not just too sure. Is this going to work out? Is he serious? Is he genuine? Is she serious? Is she genuine? And sometimes we take a chance on people. And we get criticized for it. But we take a chance. And sometimes we end up with egg in our face. And some of you are watching online even today, you're watching this. You know we've taken a chance. And sometimes we end up with egg in our face. And some of you are here today because someone took a chance on you. Someone's prepared to step up like Esther and say, you know what, I'm going to step in, I'm going to approach the king, and I'm going to do this thing, and if I die, I die. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Take a chance. And so Mordecai, and apologies if we're going on, I'm going to finish in a few minutes. Mordecai says to Esther, who knows? Who knows? But I say to you this morning, this is not about who knows. You are here for such a time as this. God works according to his time frame, according to his schedule. And he takes the stuff that sometimes the devil tries to manipulate. And I know there's stuff going on today that is so negative, that is so demonic, that is so satanic. I fully understand that. I believe that the scene's been set for the Antichrist to appear. I have no doubts about that. I have no doubts about that whatsoever. But I'm not looking for the Antichrist. I'm looking for the Christ. I'm not looking around, I'm looking up. And yes, you know, we need to be aware of all the stuff that's going on around us, and we'll be teaching that on Sunday nights after Easter time. But God's working to his time frame. God's working to his schedule. Why? Because God was the one who actually created time. Do you know that the earth is made up of time, matter, and space? Time is every bit part of creation as the material universe is, and so on, the space is. And the God who created time, who created matter, who created space, who put the stars in place and caused the planets to go in their circuits and so on. This God is not working to anyone else's time frame, to anyone else's agenda, but to his own. I want to leave this with you so that you know that this is not just stuff that happens off the cuff. I'll give you a wee taster on it as we finish this morning. God has given details as to certain events that will take place regarding time. This is our time. This is our time for the church. And we're moving into, in fact, already in the most significant time for the church because we're now in the end game. And God has given times, details of those times and seasons and events through the prophets and through his word. Jesus did say it's not for anyone to know the day nor the hour. But he did say we should know the seasons and the times that we're living in. He said that when you see certain things that happen then, that's time to look up because your redemption draws near. Daniel in Daniel 8 speaks of an appointed time. Those weren't just throwaway words. He spoke of an appointed time, and he's talking about the end of the age. The psalmist in Psalm 75 speaks of a set time. And the Jewish people understand what set time means. For them, it's the Messiah. For us, it's the return of Christ. It's a set time. Paul in Acts chapter 7, he talked about an appointed day. So an appointed time, a set time, an appointed day. But I want to tell you, friends, as we're heading towards that set time, that appointed day, there's still time for the church to be the church. There's still time for us to be the followers of Jesus Christ that he called us to be. And there's time for us to be the church in this community that God has placed us here to be. This is our time. This is our time. And it's time for us right now to grasp the moment. I want to encourage every believer in this place right now. I'm going to finish in just a moment. Worship team is going to lead us in a song as we're closing off and going to leave in a few moments. Jonathan will give us instructions how we're going to do that. But I want to encourage you, friends, as believers, to not simply look on this as another Sunday morning service. Oh, we've been to church today. We sung a few songs. Jack did okay in the word that he brought to us. Spoke a bit longer than what we thought, but he did okay nonetheless. And it's not just about having been to church. It's saying, you know what? We grasp the moment. We grasp the moment. So that when we walk out through those doors, we're looking for the fulfillment of what God has put in our hearts and put in our lives, whether it was Abraham, Joseph, Moses, others, but there's a purpose for us being here today. If you're not a Christian, what does the Word of God say about your time? You know, Paul said, he says, now is the accepted time. Today is the day of salvation. And he's saying, don't put it off. This is the moment. This is your moment. Grasp the moment. And it's your moment that in all the stuff that's going on around you, and you've got questions. We as Christians, we've got questions, and we're looking for answers. And we're not going to get all the answers the way that we want them. Certainly not this side of eternity. But what you need to do right now is to lift up your focus and to look to Christ, who so loved you that he died for you. And you're saying, God, I don't understand all that's going around me. What I do know is this. I need Jesus Christ in my life. And Paul said, well, you do that now because now is the accepted time. Today is the day of salvation.